Early on this morning of July the 10th, Allied forces, under the command of General Eisenhower, began landing operations in Sicily.
We ran into a hell of a storm the night before we were due to land, and the ship heaved and rolled, and everybody was sick in the troop decks, and it was pretty bloody miserable. But then the morning came. Well, actually, it was well before morning. It was about 12 o'clock at night, 1 o'clock in the morning, when we moved out of the darkened ship and moved up on the heaving decks and down rope ladders into these little sardine cans, which were called assault landing craft, which were heaving up and down and banging against the ship. And everything seemed confused, and I was standing in the bow of this square-nosed little vessel with my revolver drawn, and suddenly there was this thunderous great whomp. We hit something. I thought it was the beach. The cocks thought it was the beach, and down went the door. Big roar. And darkness, smoke, flickering lights. And I turned to my platoon and I said, "Follow me, men!" and rushed off the ramp and into 7 feet of water. We'd hit a sandbar 50 yards offshore. Fortunately, I went straight down and landed on my feet on the bottom, 7 feet under. And what do? I really didn't think about it. I just marched. When in doubt in the Army, march. And I marched, and I was able to hold my breath, and eventually my head came up.
Well, before we went into action, we were concerned because we had strong memories of what happened at Dieppe. Fortunately, as it turned out, the opposition was not strong. It was the shoreline was defended by Italians, and they were quite prepared to surrender. But later on, of course, we ran up against the Germans, and that was a completely different story. They were excellent fighters.
By then, the war had eroded the Italians' commitment to the ambitions of their fascist leaders. They were ready to surrender. The Germans were not. They were entrenched in the arid Sicilian hills, where crossing the terrain proved as hazardous as dodging enemy fire. It was the beginning of a long and bitter campaign. After 4 weeks of fighting, Canada's soldiers had fought their way through 120 miles of enemy territory, more than any other division in the British 8th Army.
After we landed in Pekino, I think we were probably first-rate troops, but we really didn't understand that one could be killed. And it wasn't until some time had passed and we'd seen enough bodies, friends and enemies, to begin to understand it.
It was a little over a month after the landing when Sicily was completely taken. Then across the Straits of Messina to land on the toe of the Italian boot.
The heaviest bombardment, artillery and air, ever conducted up to that point across the Straits of Messina. And when we went in, we thought it was fog, but it wasn't. It was dust that was raised up from the explosions. Everything else was flat. When the air attacks began to build up, there were fair casualties on the beach, and the beach is no place for casualties, so my commanding officer said, "Get a landing craft and we'll get these boys out to a hospital ship." Anyway, we came alongside the hospital ship, and all of a sudden I heard somebody say, "Would you like a cup of tea?" And I turned, and here was an elderly nursing sister. Well, elderly. Anybody with gray hair was elderly when we were young. And I said, "Yes, sister, please." And she brought me a lovely cup of tea in a beautiful china cup and saucer. And I said, "Just the cup, sister. I couldn't take the saucer. My hands were shaking too much." And evidently that hospital ship was hit and sunk. We came back some days later to the same beach. And this one particular day they were towing in a nursing sister. And I noticed she had gray hair. And that kind of tore it. I had to go away and be by myself for a while. And you know, it's kind of stupid. I don't know whether it was her, was the lady that gave me the tea or not, but For 50-odd years, I've been worrying and wondering about it.
I think that my major concern was, geez, I hope I do what I'm supposed to do right and don't goof it up, because I was a young buck lieutenant and I had people on my platoon that were a lot older than me and probably a lot more sharper about the military than I was at that time.
This is Matthew Halton of the CBC, speaking from Italy. We used to say, and it was true, the German was a good soldier, but that as soon as our chaps got on top of him, he gave up. That's not true here. Here we fight till we kill them. They're Germans, but I admire their guts. I'll say this, I'm very proud because my men are better than the Germans here.
In Ortona, we were against the German paratroopers, which were supposed to be the finest in the world. And they're pretty tough apples. In Ortona, they had the big square, which they called their killing ground. You know? To go in there, you're going to get killed. So what they did, they fought from house to house. You could be in one room and they're in the next room. But it was a tough battle. That was all through Christmas. And they lost a lot of men there.
CBC technicians were the first to develop equipment to enable Canadian war correspondents to report directly from the front lines. Peter Stursberg was one of them.
Well, if we were going to do a battle report, we had to be our own senses. We had to know what we could say, and we knew that we couldn't name units or regiments. This was a report I was doing on the dedication of the cemetery for those who had fallen in the Battle of Ortona.
This is Peter Stursberg of the CBC reporting from the Italian front. For the dead of Ortona, the bell of its cathedral, the Cathedral of St. Thomas the Apostle, tolls. For the Canadians who died in taking the town, and for the dust and ashes of the cathedral itself, the bell tolls.
We spent 2 winters in Italy, and it was cold, and it was wet, and it was awful muddy. We used to say that a truck would go as far as it could, then a mule would take over and go as far as it could, and finally the man took over, and he went the rest of the distance. But the mud was awful. I mean, ankle deep, stinking mud.
The Canadians who slogged their way up the Italian mainland endured a grueling campaign with fortitude and humor.
I think the beginning of the end for us, the beginning of the awareness, began at the Moro River, just below Ortona, when we got bloodied, and when we got savagely bloodied. And we began to understand that victory wasn't going to always be ours, that we were going to be defeated, and we were going to pay an enormous price for what passed for victory in those days, which was moving on from one riverbed to the next, one to the next, one to the next, never making gains of more than a mile or two, and always knowing that you're going to have to fight the same battle over again tomorrow, next week, and whatever. And at that point, morale did not deteriorate, but we became very much aware of what war was all about.
Meanwhile, a large part of the Canadian Army was neither home nor in battle, but still in England, apparently going nowhere. There was time for romance.
Everybody was dancing. I'm not that great a dancer, but anyways, I was in uniform, and I chose my wife, Doreen.
I had been dancing with a chap, and I just couldn't manage to get a cigarette or a smoke. And so I found a